This is HOA busted. The HOA made it personal, and I made it documented. My name is Jake. I'm an EMT dispatcher in Duluth, Minnesota, and I moved to Riverstone Meadows Commons Association 2 years ago because the commute to the station was perfect and the neighborhood looked quiet. I was standing in my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in May 2025 when Susan Johnson, the HOA president, came storming across the grass holding a clipboard in a clear plastic sleeve and screaming that I was in violation of emergency stop work enforcement and that I had exactly 1 hour to remove my fence or face a lien. I had no idea what she was talking about because I had pulled permits, hired a licensed contractor, and followed the city setback rules to the inch. She jabbed a finger at the fence line and said, "You restricted HOA access by putting a temporary lock on your gate during work, and that violates emergency access protocols, so this is not a normal situation and normal rules do not apply." I tried to explain that the lock was there for 2 hours while the crew poured concrete, and that the gate was open now, but she cut me off and said, "You think this is petty? I think this is my purpose." I need to back up for a second. Riverstone Meadows is a master-planned community where fences are treated like sacred law. Every board meeting has at least one fence dispute, and the Architectural Review Committee has a binder thicker than a phone book with rules about height, color, style, setback, easements, and materials. The HOA name is on every sign at every entrance, and the president, Susan Johnson, has been in charge for 6 years. People call her Diane as a nickname, and she runs the board like a personal fiefdom. She has black hair that she pulls into a bun, she wears a blue light jacket even in summer, and she always has that red bucket hat and that clipboard. The clipboard has a clear rain cover with no readable text, and she waves it like a weapon. I'm an EMT dispatcher, which means I work 12-hour shifts and I cannot miss calls. My insurance carrier had been asking for updated photos of the property because I was trying to refinance, and I had a short window to respond or the whole deal would fall apart. I needed the refinance to consolidate some medical debt from last year, so this was not optional. The fence was part of the plan because the old one was rotting, and the insurance photos showed gaps, which raised liability questions. I hired a crew, got the city permit, submitted the HOA application 3 weeks early, and got approval in writing. Or at least I thought I did. Susan showed up the day the crew started digging post holes, and said the approval was conditional, and that I had failed to meet the conditions, which she did not specify. I asked her to show me the conditions in writing, and she said they were implied by the emergency access clause in the covenants. I pulled out my phone and showed her the approval email from the Architectural Review Committee, and she said the committee does not override her authority as president during emergency enforcement. I asked what the emergency was, and she said, "Restricting access is the emergency." She pulled out that small metal pry tool from her jacket pocket and started poking the fence boards, saying the installation was shoddy and unstable. The crew was still working, and the foreman looked at me like he wanted to throw her off the property, but I shook my head and told him to keep going. Susan said she was going to file a formal stop work order and that if I continued, I would be fined $500 per day starting immediately. I said, "Show me the rule that says you can do that," and she said, "I can make this a lien conversation in one email." That line hit me like a punch because a lien threat during a refinance is a nightmare. If she put a lien on the property, even a bogus one, the bank would pull the deal and I would be stuck. I decided right then to keep my mouth shut and let her talk, because every word was helping me. I did not know exactly how yet, but I knew she was overplaying her hand, and that eventually she would give me something I could use. The crew finished the post holes that day and poured the concrete footings. Susan stood on the property line the entire time, taking photos with her phone and writing notes on that clipboard. When they packed up, she handed me a piece of paper from the clipboard and said it was a formal notice of violation with a hearing date in 10 days. The paper had no readable text because of the glare and the plastic sleeve, but she said the fine schedule was attached, and that I owed $2,000 immediately plus $500 per day until compliance. I asked her what compliance meant, and she said, "Remove the fence and restore the property to its original condition." I said, "The original condition was a rotting fence that was a safety hazard," and she said, "Then you should have applied for a variance." I went inside and called my neighbor Tom, who lives next door and has been dealing with Susan for 8 years. Tom is a retired postal worker, calm and steady, and he has seen her pull this kind of stunt before. He said, "She is bluffing, but you need to document everything because she will twist the facts at the hearing." He said he would be a witness if I needed one, and he also said that Susan has a relationship with a fence company called Boundary Solutions that does most of the installs in the neighborhood. He said, "Check the invoices, because I bet she is steering people to them and getting some kind of kickback." That night I pulled every document I had: the original HOA application, the approval email, the city permit, the contractor contract, the Architectural Review Committee bylaws, and the covenants. I also pulled the invoice from my contractor, who is an independent guy named Mike, who does not advertise and works mostly by referral. I started building a timeline in a spreadsheet, and I color-coded every communication with Susan and every document she had referenced. I also requested the HOA meeting minutes for the last 2 years under the Open Records Clause in the covenants, which says any member can request documents with 72 hours notice. Susan responded to my request by email the next morning and said that meeting minutes were only available to members in good standing and that I was currently in violation, so I was not in good standing until I paid the fines. I forwarded her email to Tom, and he laughed and said, "That is not how it works, she is just stalling." He also said that the HOA uses a management company called Piedmont Community Solutions, and that the actual authority rests with them, not with Susan, unless the board votes to delegate enforcement powers. He said, "Ask Piedmont if she has that authority, because I bet she does not." I called Piedmont the next day and spoke to a compliance officer named Angela. Angela was polite but careful, and she said that emergency stop work enforcement requires a board vote unless there is an immediate safety hazard. I asked if a temporary gate lock during concrete work qualified as a safety hazard, and she paused and said, "That does not sound like an emergency to me." I asked if Susan had the authority to issue fines without a hearing, and she said no, the process requires written notice, a hearing, and a board vote to impose penalties. I asked if she had received any documentation from Susan about my case, and she said, "I cannot discuss specifics without a formal request, but you should submit a written complaint if you believe the process was not followed." I hung up and wrote a formal complaint that afternoon. I laid out the timeline, attached the approval email, cited the bylaws, and requested an independent review. I also requested the invoices for all fence installations in the neighborhood over the last 3 years, because I wanted to see if there was a pattern of favoritism toward Boundary Solutions. I sent it to Piedmont with a copy to the entire HOA board, and I blind copied Tom so he could keep track. 2 days later, I was at work on a shift when I got a text from Tom saying that Susan had called an emergency board meeting, and that she was trying to push through a resolution to formalize the fines before the hearing. He said the meeting was that night at 7, and that I should show up. I was stuck at the dispatch desk until 8, so I called Tom and asked if he could go and record what happened. He said he would, and he also said he was bringing another neighbor, Linda, who had been fined by Susan last year over a mailbox and was still angry about it. Tom sent me a voice memo after the meeting. He said Susan had opened by saying that I was in willful violation and that the board needed to act immediately to protect the integrity of the community. She said I had refused to comply with the stop work order and that the fence was a safety hazard because it restricted emergency access. One of the board members, a guy named Rick, asked where the safety hazard was documented, and Susan said she had photos. Rick asked to see them, and Susan said she would provide them later. Another board member, a woman named Carol, asked if Piedmont had reviewed the case, and Susan said Piedmont was aware and supportive. Tom said he stood up at that point and said, "That is not true. I spoke to Piedmont and they said this was improper." Susan tried to shut him down, but Rick backed him up and said, "We need to table this until we get clarification." The vote failed 3-2, and Susan was furious. The next morning I got a call from Angela at Piedmont. She said, "I received your complaint and I have reviewed the file, and I need to inform you that the stop work order was issued without board approval and that the fine schedule is not enforceable." She said Susan had submitted a request for emergency enforcement, but it was denied because there was no safety hazard, and she said Susan went ahead anyway. Angela said, "I am recommending that the board rescind the order and issue a formal apology, but I cannot force them to do that. You will have to pursue it at the hearing." She also said, "I pulled the fence invoices like you requested, and there is a pattern. Boundary Solutions has done 23 of the last 25 installs, and several of those projects were expedited through the approval process in under a week, which is unusual." I asked if that was evidence of favoritism, and she said, "It could be, but you would need to prove that Susan has a financial relationship with the company, which I cannot investigate without a formal complaint to the state." I thanked her and hung up, and I immediately called my contractor, Mike. I told him what was happening, and he said, "I have seen this before. HOAs push owners toward preferred vendors and then claim independent contractors are not qualified." He said, "If you want proof, ask Piedmont for the approval timelines and compare them to yours, because I bet the Boundary Solutions jobs got rubber-stamped and yours got dragged out." I asked if he would testify at the hearing, and he said, "Absolutely, I have nothing to hide." That afternoon, someone tampered with my survey stakes. I came home from my shift and found that 3 of the stakes had been pulled out of the ground and tossed into the bushes, and the string line was cut. The crew had marked the property line with those stakes, and they were critical for proving that the fence was inside the setback. I took photos immediately and called the police non-emergency line. The officer who came out was polite but said there was no proof of who did it, and unless I had video, it was just a property dispute. I said, "My neighbor has a doorbell camera that faces this direction. Can we check that?" The officer said, "Only if your neighbor consents." I called Tom, and he said, "Come over, let's look." Tom's doorbell camera had caught the whole thing. At 2 in the afternoon, while I was at work, Susan walked onto my property, pulled up the stakes, cut the string line with a pair of scissors, and tossed the stakes into the bushes. The officer watched the video and said, "That is vandalism and trespassing. Do you want to press charges?" I said yes. The officer said, "I will file a report, but you should also bring this to your HOA hearing because it shows intent." Susan showed up at my door that night with a printed copy of a tow authorization slip, with no readable text held out between us. She said, "Your contractor truck has been parked in a guest spot for 3 days, and guest spots are limited to 48 hours, so I am having it towed tonight unless you move it immediately." I said, "That is Mike's truck, and he is working here, so it is not a guest vehicle." She said, "Contractors are considered guests under the parking rules, and the rules are clear." I said, "Show me the rule." She pulled out her phone and showed me a page from the covenants that said guest parking was limited to 48 consecutive hours. I said that rule applies to social guests, not contractors performing approved work. She said, "The rule does not make that distinction, and I have already called the tow company." I said, "If you tow that truck, I will sue you personally for the cost and the delay." She smiled and said, "Good luck with that," and walked away. I called Mike and told him to move the truck immediately, and then I called the tow company. I explained the situation and said that there was no valid authorization because the truck was not in violation, and I said if they towed it, I would file a complaint with the state towing board. The dispatcher said, "We need authorization from the property owner or the HOA, and we have that, so we are proceeding." I said the HOA president does not have unilateral authority to authorize tows, and I can prove it. Do you want to take that risk? The dispatcher paused and said, "Hold on, let me talk to my supervisor." 5 minutes later, he called back and said, "We are not proceeding without a board vote. Tell your contractor to move the truck, and we will call it resolved." Mike moved the truck, and I added the tow threat to my evidence file. I now had the approval email, the Piedmont denial of the stop work order, the invoice comparison showing favoritism, the doorbell video of Susan vandalizing the stakes, and the tow authorization bluff. I also had Tom and Linda as witnesses, and Mike ready to testify about the contractor intimidation. The hearing was set for the following Thursday at the community clubhouse. I spent the week organizing my evidence into a tabbed binder with printed copies of every document, and I created a timeline poster that showed the approval, the stop work order, the Piedmont denial, the stake vandalism, and the tow threat, all color-coded by date. I also had a thumb drive with the doorbell video and a printed transcript of the relevant covenant sections, with the rules that Susan had cited highlighted and annotated with notes showing why they did not apply. Tom, Linda, and Mike all agreed to come. I also reached out to another neighbor, a woman named Sarah, who had complained to me once about Susan blocking her driveway during a board inspection. Sarah said she could not testify because she was afraid of retaliation, but she gave me a written statement describing the incident and saying that Susan had a pattern of selective enforcement. I added it to the binder. The day before the hearing, Susan sent an email to the entire neighborhood saying that there would be a special session to address a serious violation of community standards and that all members were invited to attend. She did not name me, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Tom forwarded me the email and said she is trying to pack the room with her supporters, but it is going to backfire because people are tired of her. The morning of the hearing, I got a call from Angela at Piedmont. She said, "I want to give you a heads up. Susan submitted a last-minute claim that you damaged common property during the fence installation, and that you must pay for repairs immediately or be charged a daily fee." I asked what the damage was, and Angela said, "She is claiming that your contractor dug into the HOA drainage easement and that it will cost $3,000 to fix." I said, "That is a lie. We had the property surveyed, and the easement is 10 feet from the fence line." Angela said, "I know. I reviewed the survey you submitted, and the claim is baseless, but she is going to bring it up at the hearing to distract from the other issues." I thanked her and added it to my list. I arrived at the clubhouse at 6:30, 30 minutes before the hearing. The room was set up with a long table at the front for the board and rows of chairs facing it. Susan was already there, sitting in the center chair with her clipboard and a stack of papers. Rick and Carol were on either side of her, and 2 other board members I did not recognize were at the ends. There were about 20 people in the audience, a mix of Susan's supporters and people who just wanted to see what would happen. Tom, Linda, and Mike were in the front row, and Sarah was in the back looking nervous. Susan called the meeting to order at 7 and said, "We are here to address a serious violation by a homeowner who has willfully ignored HOA rules, vandalized common property, and created a safety hazard." She said, "The homeowner in question is Jake, and he has refused to comply with a lawful stop work order, refused to pay fines, and continued construction in defiance of this board." She said, "I am recommending that the board impose the maximum penalties allowed under the covenants, including a lien on the property and immediate removal of the fence at the owner's expense." I stood up and said, "I would like to respond." Susan said, "You will have your turn, sit down." Rick said, "Actually, let him speak now, we need to hear both sides." Susan glared at Rick, but she nodded. I walked to the front and set my binder on the table. I said, "I have documentation that proves every one of those claims is false." I opened the binder to the approval email and said, "I applied for a fence permit 3 weeks in advance and received written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." Susan interrupted and said, "That approval was conditional." I said, "Show me the conditions in writing." She said, "They were implied." I said, "That is not how contracts work. If there were conditions, they needed to be stated in the approval." And they were not. I flipped to the next tab and said, "The stop work order was issued without board approval, which violates your own bylaws." I have a letter from Piedmont Community Solutions confirming that the order was improper and that Susan acted without authority. I pulled out Angela's letter and handed copies to each board member. Carol read it and said, "Is this true?" Angela had included a note at the bottom saying that she was available to answer questions, and Carol said, "I want to hear from Piedmont directly." Susan said, "This is an internal matter. We do not need outside interference." Rick said, "Piedmont is our management company. They are not outside, and if they say the order was improper, we need to address that." I moved to the next tab and said, "I also have evidence that Susan has been steering homeowners toward a preferred fence contractor and expediting their approvals while delaying others." I pulled out the invoice comparison and the timeline Angela had provided, and I passed copies around. I said, "Boundary Solutions has done 23 of the last 25 fence installs in this neighborhood, and their approvals took an average of 5 days, while mine took 3 weeks. Rick looked at the numbers and said, "That does seem like a pattern." Susan said, "Boundary Solutions is a reputable company, and their work meets our standards." I said, "My contractor is also licensed and insured, and his work meets the same standards, but you have been harassing him and threatening to tow his truck." Mike stood up and said, "I can confirm that. She has called me 4 times in the last 2 weeks trying to get me to stop work." I moved to the video evidence. I said, "I also have proof that Susan trespassed on my property and vandalized my survey stakes." I played the doorbell video on my laptop, and the room went silent as everyone watched Susan pull up the stakes and cut the string line. When it finished, Carol said, "That is vandalism. Why would you do that?" Susan said, "Those stakes were in the wrong place. I was correcting the property line." I said, "The stakes were placed by a licensed surveyor, and the property line is clearly marked in the county records. You had no authority to touch them." Rick said, "This is serious. If you vandalized his property, that is a criminal matter." I said, "I have already filed a police report." If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA revenge stories where the rules get turned back on the enforcers. I moved to the final piece of evidence. I said, "Susan also threatened to have my contractor's truck towed using a fake authorization, and when the tow company called her bluff, she backed down." I have a recording of the call where the tow dispatcher confirmed that they would not proceed without a board vote. Susan said, "Parking rules are clear, and I was enforcing them." I said, "The rule applies to social guests, not contractors, and you know that because you have never enforced it against Boundary Solutions." Rick said, "I have heard enough. I move to rescind the stop work order and dismiss all fines." Carol said, "I second." Susan said, "We have not heard all the evidence. I have a claim for damage to common property." I said, "Let's address that now." I pulled out the survey map and said, "The HOA drainage easement is 10 feet from my fence line, and my contractor did not touch it." Susan said, "Your contractor dug into the easement and caused erosion." Mike stood up and said, "That is a lie. I have photos of every post hole and they are all inside the property line." He pulled out his phone and showed the board a photo album with date stamps and measurements. Carol looked at the photos and said, "These clearly show that the work is compliant." Susan's face was turning red. She said, "You are all being manipulated by a homeowner who thinks he is above the rules." Tom stood up and said, "No, we are tired of you abusing your authority and targeting people who do not use your preferred vendors." Linda stood up and said, "You fined me $200 last year for a mailbox that was 1 inch too tall, and you never even measured it, you just eyeballed it and sent me a bill." Another neighbor in the back stood up and said, You blocked my driveway during an inspection and refused to move your car, and when I complained, you said I was being difficult." Rick said, "I think we need to take a vote." He said, "I move to rescind the stop work order, dismiss all fines against Jake, issue a formal apology, and refer Susan's conduct to Piedmont for review." Carol said, "I second." The vote was 4-1, with Susan voting no. Rick said the motion passes. Susan said, "This is not over. I will appeal this to the state." Rick said, "You can try, but based on what we have seen tonight, I do not think you will win." I went home that night feeling like I had won, but I knew Susan was not done. The next morning I got an email from Angela saying that Piedmont was conducting a formal review of Susan's conduct and that the board had requested a full audit of HOA finances and vendor relationships. Angela said, "We are looking at all fence contracts over the last 3 years, and if we find evidence of kickbacks or favoritism, we will refer it to the state attorney general." 2 weeks later, I got a letter from Piedmont. It said, "After a thorough review, we have determined that Susan Johnson violated HOA bylaws by issuing unauthorized stop work orders, vandalizing homeowner property, and showing favoritism toward a preferred vendor." The letter said, "The board has voted to issue a written reversal of all penalties against you, and Susan has been removed from her position as president pending further investigation." The letter also said, "We have referred the matter to the state for review of potential ethics violations." I called Tom and told him the news. He said, "It is about time. She has been running this place like a dictatorship for years." He said the board is scheduling a special election to replace her, and a lot of people are talking about running. A week after that, I got a call from a woman who identified herself as an investigator with the Minnesota Attorney General's office. She said, "We are investigating allegations of vendor favoritism and kickbacks in your HOA, and we would like to speak with you." I gave her everything I had: the invoice comparison, the approval timelines, the emails, and the video. She said, "This is very helpful. We are also looking at Boundary Solutions contracts with the HOA, and we have found some irregularities." 3 months later, the state released a report finding that Susan had accepted payments from Boundary Solutions in exchange for steering homeowners toward the company and expediting their approvals. The report said that Susan had received over $15,000 in kickbacks over 3 years, and that the HOA had overpaid for fence installations by an average of 30%. The state fined Susan $25,000 and banned her from serving on any HOA board in Minnesota. The HOA also filed a civil suit to recover the overpayments, and Boundary Solutions settled for $50,000. The fence was finished 2 weeks after the hearing, and the city inspector signed off on it without any issues. My insurance carrier accepted the photos, and my refinance closed on schedule. I saved about $400 a month on the new mortgage, which covered the cost of the fence and then some. The special election to replace Susan was held in August, and Rick won in a landslide. His first act as president was to pass a resolution banning emergency stop work orders unless there is a documented safety hazard and requiring all vendor contracts to be publicly posted. He also hired a new management company to replace Piedmont, because the board felt that Piedmont had been too slow to act on Susan's abuses. I ran into Susan one more time, at the grocery store in October. She was in the checkout line ahead of me, and she turned around and saw me. She said, "You destroyed my reputation." I said, "No, you did that yourself." She said, "You think you won, but you just made yourself a target. Everyone in this neighborhood knows your name now." I said, "Good. Maybe they will think twice before they let someone like you run the HOA again." She did not say anything else, and she left. Tom threw a small party at his house a few weeks later to celebrate the new board. Linda was there, and Mike, and a bunch of other neighbors who had been targeted by Susan over the years. Tom raised a glass and said, "Here is to standing up to bullies, even when they have a clipboard." Everyone laughed, and someone said, "Especially when they have a clipboard." The funny thing is, the whole mess started because Susan thought she could bully me into using her vendor and paying her fake fees, but she ended up losing her position, her reputation, and $25,000 because she pushed too hard. Her favorite fee, the one she had been threatening me with, turned out to be completely imaginary, and when the state auditor went through the HOA ledger, they found that she had been charging homeowners for violations that did not exist and pocketing the money. The board had to issue refunds to 14 families, and the total came to over $8,000. At the final board meeting where the written reversal was approved, Rick read Susan's bluff out loud, the one where she said she could make it a lien conversation in one email, and the room erupted in laughter. Carol said, "That line is going to follow her for the rest of her life." Rick said, "Good, maybe it will remind her that threats only work if you have the authority to back them up." The state report also noted that Susan had claimed emergency authority in 6 other cases over the past 2 years, and in every case, she had used it to pressure homeowners into hiring boundary solutions. The report said, "This pattern of abuse demonstrates a deliberate scheme to defraud homeowners and enrich herself at the expense of the community." The insurance carrier for the HOA reviewed the findings and issued a non-renewal warning, saying that the association had to implement new governance controls within 60 days or lose coverage. The board moved fast, adopting new bylaws that required board votes for all enforcement actions, annual audits of vendor contracts, and mandatory training for board members on fiduciary duty. The insurance company accepted the reforms and renewed the policy, but they increased the premium by 15%, and the board sent Susan a demand letter for the difference, which came to about $3,000 per year for 5 years. I kept the metal pry tool that Susan had used to poke my fence. I found it in the grass after one of her inspections, and I kept it on my desk as a reminder that bullies always overreach. Every time I see it, I think about how close I came to caving and just paying her off, and how much worse it would have been if I had. The new board also passed a rule banning board members from accepting payments or gifts from vendors, and they created a vendor rotation system so that no single company could dominate the approvals. Boundary Solutions lost their preferred status, and within 6 months they went out of business because their prices were not competitive once the kickbacks stopped. My fence is still standing, and it looks great. I get compliments on it all the time, and I always tell people the story of how it almost cost me my house. Most people laugh, but a few have said, "That is exactly why I will never buy in an HOA." I understand the sentiment, but I also think that HOAs can work if the board is accountable and the rules are enforced fairly. The problem is when someone like Susan gets in charge and decides that the rules only apply to other people. I still live in Riverstone Meadows, and I am still an EMT dispatcher. The refinance saved me enough money that I was able to pay off the medical debt and start saving again. The fence cost about $4,000 total, and I figure I saved about that much in the first year, just from the lower mortgage payment, so it was worth every penny. Tom is still my neighbor, and we still talk about the hearing every now and then. He said, "I have been in this neighborhood for 8 years, and that was the most satisfying thing I have ever seen." He said the look on Susan's face when you played that video was worth the price of admission. I ran into Angela from Piedmont one more time, at a coffee shop near the station. She said, "I just wanted to thank you for bringing that situation to light, because it helped us identify problems in a lot of other communities we manage." She said, "We have since updated our policies to require board votes for all enforcement actions, and we are auditing vendor relationships across all our accounts." I said, "I am glad something good came out of it." She said, "You stood up for yourself, and that made a difference." The whole experience taught me that HOAs are only as good as the people running them, and that the rules can be weaponized if no one pushes back. I also learned that documentation is everything, because without that binder and that video, I never would have won. If you are dealing with an HOA dispute, my advice is to keep everything in writing, know the bylaws better than the board does, and do not be afraid to escalate if you are in the right. Susan moved out of Riverstone Meadows about a year after the state report came out. I heard from Tom that she sold her house at a loss because the scandal had tanked her reputation and no one wanted to deal with her. She tried to fight the state fine, but the court upheld it, and last I heard, she was still paying it off in installments. The new board is not perfect, but they are a lot better. They listen to homeowners, they follow the process, and they do not play favorites. Rick has been president for almost 2 years now, and he is up for re-election next month. He is running unopposed, which tells you everything you need to know. I finished the refinance, the fence is done, and the insurance photos were accepted without any issues. The whole nightmare lasted about 4 months from start to finish, but it felt like a year. I am just glad it is over, and I am glad I fought back instead of giving in. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.